Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Mound Cold War Discovery Center. My name is Bob Bowman. I once upon a time was a worker here at Mound, like many others, and now a board member on the Mound Science and Energy Museum Association. We don't operate the museum anymore, but we support it. And one of the programs that we've been running that started almost 30 years ago was having monthly seminars. And this is an example of one we're doing tonight, and it's tied in with technology and Dayton history. So I'm not going to take a whole lot of time, but I want Don to have the opportunity to explain all his information. So at the end, I'll talk about what we're going to do next month. But again, welcome. And I'm going to introduce Don Gray, who's going to talk about McCook Field, which many of us might have heard something about, but didn't know what the connection was to technology and to the 21st century. So welcome, Don, and everyone else.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Is this all going to be okay right here? All right, good. Evening, ladies and gentlemen. So my name is Don Gray. I've been in the Dayton area for about 30 years, and for about 22 of them, I've been a volunteer at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. So I'm going to put my plugs in for those types of things too. So I want to talk about McCook Field. Really quick show of hands. How many people are aware of McCook Field? I like that. So some of you may have been aware of or actually read this book, all right? This is what got me started. Now I'm an aviation buff and a reasonable historian kind of a guy. And after reading the book, knowing certain amount, when I was in the Air Force, I was life support systems, and my second assignment before I discharged was Wright Field. And this was an interesting discovery on my part to say, hey, what are the real roots of this place? We all know about how much is around here and the Wright brothers and all that. So I read through the book, and a theme kind of came up from my approach, which is what I wanted to spend our time with tonight, and to share you a little piece of history. I've discovered that I could probably come back about 6 weeks or 6 sessions in a row and have a different topic about McCook Field every time, with all the things that got developed at this particular organization. And I hope some of you have some knowledge, maybe read the book, and have some other research that you've done, have an idea that once you see my theme unfold, you'll have a better understanding of how this really plays as a very interesting story. Just a minute, I have to get my pointer here. I have to be able to point things. So, turn this on. If we think about it, we're very well known nowadays for AFRL, amongst other things, also Air Force Materials Command. But if we think about how this got started, which was with McCook Field, as of right now, Air Force Engineering, Air Force Researching, has been here since 108 years. And if we reflect on it, how is it that we've been able to keep it here for that long? Well, I think the organizational structure that unfolds is very interesting here. So let's get into a story. How did it come about in the first place? This is one of the very interesting things, and to me, one of the sad things is that the best we have from McCook Field, other than old pictures, right, is a little plaque on the bike trail that says McCook Field was over there, right? Now we can know at least where it is. And fortunately, there's still a fair amount of open land that's over there off between the bike trail and Kiwi Street. But anything that resembles McCook Field is gone, and that's kind of sad from that standpoint. Why does it? I have to do the old manual way here. I'm going to show you a timeline of a set of events as they unfold. And we've just done an interesting expansion of a display out at the Air Force Museum on a couple pieces here. But in 1907, right, the Aeronautical Division of the Signal Corps, which came out of the Civil War, all right, was created by Brigadier General James Allen. And of all things, he recognized that there was some aeronautics going on. In 1906, we got back into balloons, and by 1907, we had one dirigible. And so he said, there's some direction going on. By the way, on the sidebar, Wilbur and Orville, mainly Wilbur, are trying to convince the Army that we need to have an airplane. And so that's kind of in parallel going in there. And how much influence to Brigadier General Allen, I don't know. But reality is he creates the division. And by the way, he created the very first airman, or as we look at it, the very first airman, Eddie Ward. So this is where this starts. The July 18, 1914, right, just before World War I starts, we have the aviation section of the Signal Corps created, right? Now here's an interesting statistic. We're gone from 1907, we get our first airplane in 1909, it's now 1914, the war's about to start. How big is the Air Force?
One airplane.
Six airplanes. By the way, in 1909, they bought 2 airplanes for $25,000. Right? Bought 2 airplanes. Actually, it turned out to be 35 because there were some bonuses thrown into it. But bought 2 airplanes. And then by 1914, you have 6 airplanes, 14 pilots, 19 officers, and 101 enlisted people. We're ready to go to war, folks. We just can't wait to get there. So with the war breaking out, already the Europeans were way ahead of us, right? They're moving right along with their development efforts there. So then you get into the NACA gets created. A lot of us didn't realize how early that created, and it had a tremendous effect on future development going on. Okay? We have a conflict, right? And the conflict is the Mexican skirmish, if you will. Now, there's a lot of credit that goes on out to, we used airplanes there, we used J-1s down there, and it wasn't very successful, right? They couldn't handle the dirt and all that kind of stuff, the dust and the wind and all those types of things, and they weren't very good with their accuracy with shooting, right? But nonetheless, that's where we had to start. We move on to November of 16. There was a recognition that we're going to see a lot of development here, and we have to be at least prepared, right? And we think we're going to get involved with this, but Woodrow Wilson was not very interested in doing that, okay? So on April 6th, well, we commenced with, we've got to be a part of this action here. So we joined the war. Now, we have spent a lot of money, and we've created a lot more aircraft, but in no way are we prepared to be able to go into a combat situation, certainly with our aircraft. So one of the things that is significant about our role in there, there's only one airplane and fundamentally only one engine, the Liberty engine, that we contributed to World War I. But significant as they were, they did play a nice, interesting part. Right? June of 17, right, control of the military aviation turned over to the aviation section of the Signal Corps. And then France requests, look at the date, you know how big we were, or little we were, requested 20,000 airplanes and 40,000 mechanics. We responded favorably to that with a verbal response, but there was no way that we would be able to contribute to that. So what drives the next action here is August 17, the aviation section becomes the Aircraft Experimental Engineering Organization, and that, right, where are we going to put this place? And at this time, there's a lot of interest in where can we put this? And Washington, D.C. was going to be configured to be Fort Myer as the key location to be able to do this. But there were people here, what's his name? Wilbur, Orville, actually, well, Wilbur's passed by now. Orville was there, Edward Deeds is here, Charles Kettering is here, and we're, as a community of Dayton, Ohio, we're a very strong engineering core. Maybe some of you know, maybe some of you don't know, but to this day, we are still one of the leading tool and die organizations in the country, and certainly were back then. There was a field, believe it or not, and I almost stuck this picture, another one of the pictures in here. There's a field called North Field. And after some research, because that Deeds offered up his facility in Moraine, but because he was connected to the government, they couldn't use that. So they had to find another place, and fundamentally, in about a week, and looking around at spaces, and something that was a real simple airfield called North Field, they said, this thing's going to work. So on October 1st, you get the lease of the field. October 13th, the department is created, and on the 18th, it's dedicated. That's how fast it went. And now we have this land that is between the Miami River and the Mad River and Kiowee Street. And Kiowee Street was in place at that point in time as far as, well, this is where this is going to be. So we begin to occupy it by December. They started to create some facilities for them. Where were they before that? The organizational units that formed until they could actually get to the field were in buildings in downtown Dayton. And they had some of them already operating there, but there they continued to develop and go on from there. So on the 18th, the Aircraft Engineering Department reorganizes, given full responsibility for building experimental models. And that's kind of a critical thing, experimental models. We have not gotten until after the war, and after we get into the 20s, do we get into really working with outside manufacturers, the Lockheeds of the world, if you will, and the organization is, what do we need to be able to have now when we look at AFRL and AFMC, right? Test experimental models, engines, accessories, and the final approval for all changes, right? That becomes significant. So we've created a centralized location here. Why Dayton? And here are some of the locations that you see up on the map that were considered, all the way to Chicago, all the way down to things like Nashville and other locations, Columbus, Cleveland. All of those were possibilities. But the old arm twisting of the locals here were able to secure this is where the commitment was going to be. And once we found the field, right, North Field turned it into McCook Field, right, that's where we headed. By the way, a fast story, in case you don't know this piece here, what's the name McCook Field? Well, McCook Field is about the Fighting McCooks. And the McCooks were a huge family, many families were very large, in the Civil War. And about a third of the sons, nephews, whatnot, were actually killed in the Civil War. But part of North Field was actually owned by the McCooks. And so in a dedication effort, that's how that name came on about initially for naming of the field. This is a good example of it, all right? Miami, Mad, and Kiowee Street right along there. And this is about a 3,200 foot kind of very fine gravel runway that was put in there. And one of the reasons that you get into the problem with McCook is if we know anything about this community here, guess what? That way is the prevailing winds, actually coming at it from this particular direction here. Downtown Dayton is right over here, all right, where the Mad River comes around the bend. We have a little baseball stadium now and the like. Here's one of the interesting, significant changes that takes place. And by the way, I read a paper by a grad student at the University of Dayton. He wrote it in 1964. And he goes in tremendous detail about the organizational evolution that takes place at McCook Field. I don't have enough time over the next month to tell you about all those changes. It was absolutely amazing to see how this thing still survived because of what happened or what didn't happen there. But he creates the Signal Corps officer relieved of responsibility for the aviation section. This is General George Squire. Director of Military Aeronautics, appointed by the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Army. He appoints Brigadier General Kenley as commander, and look who his assistant is. If you know anything about history with Hap Arnold, he was the assistant director to this new organization. The Bureau of Aircraft Production, better known as BAP, right, was established and responsible for production of airplanes, airplane engines, and aircraft equipment. And this is equipment that's going to be approved by McCook Field. So you begin to see some connections. The BAP is built as headquartered in Washington, D.C. Okay. The name change, the aviation section of the Signal Corps, becomes the Army Air Service. And eventually it's going to become the Army Air Corps, and then it's going to become the Army Air Force over time up to, that Army Air Force comes out in 1940. Right? So with this appointment, we really have a lot of direction. Right? So the creation of the organization chart. Now, I can guess by looking at the crowd out here that we've got some very interesting people with some very interesting backgrounds. I myself personally have had a career in sales and sales development and working with a lot of large organizations and how they manage their business and manage it from a sales standpoint. So I've got a little interesting exposures there. I want you to imagine you have the opportunity and no problem with the funds, all funds available, to create an experimental organization. What would it look like, right? We can almost think of the mound right here and some of the things that went into, oh, we need this and we need that. The picture I'm going to put up next is the organization structure that by the early part of 1918, remember we started in October 1st of 1917, this is what came together. So if you look at that, these are individual departments. Any company that you work for one department, I worked in another department. This is what they had. Let's take a look at this. Airplane design. You had a group of people whose focus was, how do we design them? Experimental factory. All right, you design them, we'll build them. So they built experimental aircraft. The idea was, in building an aircraft and testing it and saying, we're going to make this production, somebody else was going to build it. But we built airplanes at McCook Field. Aeronautical research, coordinate our contracts with outside organizations. Mechanical research, a test engine facility was built, right? Chemical factory, we're going to test fuels, we're going to test spark plugs, right? Whatever. Aircraft armament section, what are we going to put on this thing? Because we figured out that everybody else was making bombs and shooting guns. How are we going to be able to do that, right? Engineering department, managing the contracting for something once it's built. Propeller research. One of the things that a lot of people have noted is on the 1903 Flyer, how efficient their propellers were. Right? We had the idea that as we built bigger and better propellers, we're going to have to do some experimentation and keep that productivity. So we had a whole group that was just focused on that. Materials, all sorts of materials started to be investigated, and that was a part of the McCook Field. Director of flying, so you had a group of experimental pilots, right? They were under an organization. And some of the things I'll share with you this afternoon, where you'll see how this will really unfold with some of the different things that they did. Radio equipment and communications as it developed. The initial airplanes we know were very, very simple. And with the storyline that I want to build here is that they continued to grow in that. Now, these organizations work with outside firms. They work with GE, they work with MIT, they work with a number of different organizations. But this was the central hub for it. Plane communications, instrument development. First instruments, we all know were pretty simple, right? Ordnance development, bombs, what are we gonna do with those, right? Technical publications and library. We became the forefront of centralized library of publications at McCook Field. And as the field grew, we saw people come into the community here researching what we had on engines, what we had on aircraft, what we had on all the things that are up on the board now. Engine assembly and testing, conduct engine testing here. By the end of World War I, we had probably one of the greatest selections of engines, and actually in 1918, we had an engine museum. Call it a museum for lack of a better word. This is where we brought all these things from Europe, from all those manufacturers in England and France and Italy and Germany that we had captured or brought on over. Now, it was not a true museum in the sense it's open to the public. It was open to engineers, right? And engineers were allowed to come in here, and they did. And as a part of that, they went and they used the library and just got some additional research going on. So this is the organization. By the end of the first quarter of 1918, this is what this facility looked like as far as departments and structure. Imagine that today. This is a massive organization today, and yet here it is at the beginning of the aeronautical world, and certainly as the airplane is going to grow. Here's some of the key things that came out, and this is only a list, and this is out of World War I, what our contributions were during World War I. So we had two interesting airplanes that we built, whereas the USA Combat 1 and 2. The redesign of the DH-4. Probably one of the most significant things that we did was redesign the DH-4 into the DH-9. We still tend to commonly call it the DH-4, the de Havilland, but it was our design, or our changes to it, our standardization. The biggest thing that came along from aircraft design was a standardization on how you design it and how you document it. And that's where the library really comes into play. The DH-4 is the only aircraft that the U.S. committed to the World War I fight, right? Everything else we did, learning-wise, we learned off of everybody else's airplanes and trainers that we built here. Redesign of standardization of manufacturing. What I pointed out was this organization was designed to be able to, this is what we're going to build, now you can build it and you have a standard structure with which to be able to do it. Creation of the Nelson synchronization gun. A lot of times I get asked on tours out there is, well, how do you shoot through the propellers? And probably most of you out here know that it's a timing, right? And there was, the Germans and the English were, I really honestly don't know who's first. I believe it was the Germans, but the English were working at the same time. Well, when we got involved as well. And we built the Nelson synchronizer, and that became efficient because we could use it on both two-bladed propellers and three-bladed propellers. And they were able to make the adjustments for being able to shoot through the props. Designed the cooling systems for the Liberty engines. Oh, excuse me, first sand testing. Sand testing is where they would load the wings of the airplane and bounce them to see what kind of structural integrity was within the aircraft, all right? Now we've evolved that into all sorts of structural testing as we move forward in today's modern world. But this was an idea that came up from MIT, and they came up with the idea of, hey, you know, build a platform area where you can then load this thing with sand and add more sand and add more sand to it and add sand to the wings. And you look at some of the pictures that are out there, and it's pretty amazing how they loaded these things up, and they could test whether the airframe was going to be substantial or not. Cooling systems, we built the largest wind tunnel, which lasted into the 40s, all right? It was, the mouth of it was 5 feet in diameter. We have one that's about 1.5 feet in diameter that's in the museum right now. That was also at McCook Field. Both of those got transferred over to Wright Field when they closed McCook Field. They developed gasoline systems for better flow. They actually did testing of oil across the country, and they found that the best oil, the cleanest oil they could get as a start point was California, what they were pulling out of California. So kind of fascinating what they were able to develop. But then to further make the gasoline more efficient, they came up with TEB, adding lead to the system in order to make it more effective and burn more efficiently. This was a quote, and I'm embarrassed to make the statement, but it is, when I wrote it down, I was so pleased with it, I forgot to write the author down. And I have been searching for 3 years to find this person. But nonetheless, I do have this as an exact quote by the individual who actually put it there. The Army began with no experimentation in engineering, right? When we went into the war in April of 1917, as I told you, it wasn't much bigger than what it was in 1914. We had nothing. And the organizational structure of the engineering world brought this together, which really makes it kind of interesting and significant. Yes. It doesn't want me to use my clicker. All right. The war is over. A lot of money got poured into McCook Field. There was not no bottom line, just go ahead and spend the money. They were cautious, but at the same time, there was a lot of interesting developments that went on there. Between November 11th, 1918, and the middle of December, they cut the budget for McCook Field by about 2/3, right? They just go, we don't need to worry about this stuff, right? Airplanes, it's almost flabbergasting when you look at the success of aerial combat in whatever form on whatever country that you had in World War I, to walk away from it when you get back and say, well, the war's over, we don't need this anymore, right? But that's exactly what happened in McCook Field. So creativity kicks into place. So what goes on when you go forward from here? Okay. So I want to go about, first off, some accomplishments that lead to the second part of where I take the story. But the story is the road to the modern airway. And I was telling Bob, as we were getting ready up here at the front, think about today. You go out, you make a reservation, you get on an airplane, get on that airplane, I don't care where you get on it. You go from point A to point B, right? Hopefully safely, right? Sometimes we question things from people like Boeing, but nonetheless, all right, get from point A to point B, and you land the airplane, all right? Well, we're so accustomed to that, all right, this is really straightforward and simple. No, it's not, right? And this is where McCook comes into play. So the central theme of this going forward is that the corner or the center of what's going on is at McCook. Not everything got developed there, but everything got coordinated there. So let's take a look, okay? The first thing that happens, the first thing we want to bring about, which happened before McCook Field, but is the Liberty engine, the creation of the Liberty engine. I think we all know about how famous that engine was, right? We recognized that we needed to have something there. What's really interesting there is Edward Deeds led this project. He saw the particular need for it. The timeline is what I want you guys to be impressed with, is how fast this took place, all right? Two interesting people, Jesse Vincent, VP Engineering of Packard, right? And E.J. Hall, engineering designer and co-owner of Hall Scott Motor Car, right? Two automobile people, right, came together at the request of Deeds. They put themselves in a room. On May 29, 1917 was the first meeting. June 3rd, okay, right? The patent, the first design comes on out. And July 3rd, the first sample engine's ready to go. Now, for our military, how fast would that happen today, right? I think this was pretty quick, and I think there was some motivation. Part of the reason is two highly focused engineers and a motivation. Ed Deeds, for what he contributed to it, and Edward Deeds was an engineer in his own right as well, right? Over 12,000 built, major contribution to World War I, remained in the inventory till 1934. And their first version was the 12-cylinder, but they then built an 8, then they built a 6, then they built a 4. So the Liberty has variations on all of that. So one of the things was important was the engine development, and they had a major engineering section of McCook Field. Improve the reciprocal engine, improve the performance, the success comes out making all sorts of individual changes and designs on this that they could then put out into the production world. Improve the Liberty engine, right? And most significant thing was the supercharger, right? This is allowing us to go at much higher elevation. So they recognized the need. They couldn't get up very high before. They had engine difficulties here. So we worked with GE and Sanford Moss to be able to come up with the supercharger, right? And the first place we put it on was the Liberty engine, right? Advancements in the fuels, anti-knock gas, right? And the development of the TEB, tetrayl ethyl, right? TEL with lead put into the engine there. So in this one category, here's one of the things that comes on about. Flying higher. Well, if I've got the supercharger, right, then I have an opportunity to start doing some high-level flying. Okay? The contributors there, aerial photography, parachute development, and engine development contribute to this. So we have out in the museum, if you want to see one, I don't know the specific history of ours because there was only about 16 of these built. It was a big contract for it, but the war ended. So again, we didn't need to build the Lusac anymore, but we used them for testing purposes, and we had the turbocharged engine on it. The supercharged engine on it. Then we get into some records. Rudolf Schroeder hit in February of 1920, 33,000 feet. Remember, above 10,000 feet, you really want to have oxygen. We didn't have it back then, all right? Some interesting challenges came out from both him and McGrady for how high they flew. McGrady actually had a point where his eyes froze because he didn't have, he was up so high, he had some goggles on, but it froze because he lifted them off to see his gauges. Well, maybe he shouldn't have done that. He became blind and he started to descend, and he was down to about 1,500 feet when his eyes unfroze and he could kind of see what was out there. But nonetheless, he set himself a very interesting record. Now with this, we realize there's something else going on, right? Again, we don't have the oxygen on here. So at McCook Field, one of the things that gets created is a pressurized cockpit, whereas we don't need it. Now, this is a picture of it over here on the lower right-hand side. You had a small window out the front and 2 side windows, and that's it. So flying it was not the easiest thing in the world, but what it did bring about, remember here, we're talking about 1920, it did bring about the ability for us to not have to have the oxygen mask. Now other things are going to unfold over time, pretty interesting here. But flying higher, now we look at, whoops, went a little too fast there, with the other flying higher, and I'm only touching on what we all accomplished here at McCook Field. So the objective was to improve cameras and to improve everything that goes along with the camera, the ability to handle the colder climate by being up high, the film that had to go into this. And the 2 leaders of this, in the beginning, this was Lieutenant George Goddard. Billy Mitchell was the one who recruited Goddard out of Florida to come up to Dayton, to McCook Field, to be able to start developing the advancement of the camera. So we work with the land camera organization to improve the ability to do that, right? Albert Stevens comes into play as they shipped Goddard overseas for a few years and then brought him back to kind of close out the time at McCook Field. The success is as they re-engineered stereo equipment. What you mean by stereo equipment is I can take 2 pictures, right, 2 cameras, and be able to look at the ground and now measure depth of field. And that became really, really significant for them. Aerial surveys. One of the interesting ways that McCook Field made money is they built these cameras and they sold the ability, we'll survey your farm, or we'll survey your community. And they went out there at a price and were flying over various communities and various areas and giving them survey pictures back, and that drove in some revenue for them to do other types of adventure things. Night aerial photography, I'm going to skip over the jumps in just a second. Night aerial photography. One of the things they developed at McCook was the lighting ability. Well, what is that lighting ability? Well, what they would do is they have flares that would go down, and they built some significant flares to really, for night photography, to be able to light up the area and keep it lit. And we see that today. You can see it kind of in fireworks, but they're very, very brief. But these things were long burning, and so you can get some interesting pictures. So if you look at the picture on the bottom there, that's going over what is McCook Field, all right, at 1,000 feet. Looks pretty clear. So the lenses and the film development that was collaborated on in order to get this as something that was going to be significant. And of course, then the other picture there is downtown Dayton from 31,540 feet, right? The camera went through an awful lot of development. And if we look at the reconnaissance that we do today, or the reconnaissance that we've had last month, John was here, we was talking about the SR-71 and all the reconnaissance that you were able to do that. The real roots of that are coming from the work done by the photographic group within McCook Field. All right. I was in life support systems. Fortunately, I didn't have to jump out of an airplane, or the people that I work with didn't. But anybody who has really had a recognition of this. Where were parachutes? Parachutes were started in the 1800s from crazy people, attempting to survive jumping off of kites or buildings or things like that. Right? But the real development starts with World War I, and there were a number of manufacturing style of parachutes that were built from all the countries that are out there. Everybody seemed to have one. The interesting aspect is the main people who were using them were the people who were in the observation balloons, because they were a good target, and if they got shot, they had a few seconds with which they can climb over that basket, jump out. And this is anybody. This is the Germans, this is the British, this is the French, this is the Americans, right? That was one of the primary usages of it, right? We got a hold of those during the war, and at the end of the war, we had a parachute development structure at McCook Field. And they went and tested every one of the parachutes that was used, found out what was wrong with it. They used dummies, okay? There were a couple of accidents where somebody lost their life, but they used dummies, threw them out of airplanes and see how they would work. And they came up with some interesting development techniques. First off, they found that, remember the times were 1920, 1919, 1920, 1921, that silk for the canopy was the way to go, right? They tested various sizes of the canopy itself. The shrouds, it also was worthwhile to use silk, right? Where was the best silk? All right, Japan. And so we bought, in the early days, we bought a lot of silk from Japan and a lot of silkworms, and started to grow the silkworms here so that we could manufacture the parachutes, right? The other thing is you have the vent hole at the top. And what came to be in 3 different styles of chutes was a 24-foot canopy, a vent hole at the top, and a chest pack, a backpack, or a seat pack, all of the same configuration. Now, in my life support systems role, I never did repack. Some of you may be familiar with that, but I did check to make sure that everything was there and rigged and appropriate. But I was in the Air Force between 66 and 69, and the parachutes they had there were the 1922 parachutes that they standardized on. And they're still using those today as your basic parachute. We know about the parasails and all the advancements that they've done, but the raw basic parachute is there. Now, if you look at some of the things that cargo organizations do, our cargo systems here, and the things that we drop from cargo planes, that concept was, what's the weight of the parachute? I mean, what's the weight of the object that I'm dropping, and how big does the parachute have to be? And they're using the original design that came out of the development from McCook Field. So I think it's really significant that what we were able to do was to be able to play around with all sorts of designs. One of the things that I've put on there is Staff Sergeant. There's a lot of people who contributed to this design, and one of them is a gentleman by the name of Staff Sergeant Ralph Bottrell. He did 500 jumps, right? I know some pretty expert parachutists who haven't even done 150 or 200 of them are that. He did 500 and he helped with the design of the parachute there, okay? Harold Harris, October 14th. There's a fun story there. The first pilot from the U.S. Air Corps to jump out of a disabled airplane and survive is Harold Harris. He's the first member. He's got serial number 00001 of the Caterpillar Club, meaning he jumped out and survived. And both locations where the plane came down and where he landed still exist on Valley Street over there just east of downtown Dayton. Aircraft ran into an interesting mechanical problem. He could not save the airplane. He said, well, I'm going to test this parachute, right? And he was very successful going out. There's some fun stories in later years and how he remembers how that whole incident takes place. Advancing the propeller. I mentioned the efficiency level that they said about the Wright brothers propeller. This is something that we continue to be able to do at the McCook Field. We become the center for propeller testing in the 20s at this point in time. Different people are making propellers, but they send them to our facility, that guy, in order to be able to test out the efficiency of the propellers. So a lot of interesting things came here, and a lot of things broke, all right? And a lot of things. The metal parachute is developed, the metal propeller is developed at McCook Field. Okay. All right. So thinking about what some of these things bring to bear. The engines are improved, the airplanes are being designed better, you've got parachutes, etc. Where do we take it from here? And so what unfolds in the 20s, in the early 20s, is the desire to say, how far can we take the airplane? And the roots of that, and a lot of the activity of that, is again at McCook Field. So the objective from the McCook Field standpoint, advance the ability to fly any distance. And we show some interesting things at the museum. Many of you, I'm sure, the flights to and from Alaska, the first flights across the country, the first flights around the world. But it all gets started at McCook with the idea of, we think we've got something that's got some solidity to it, all right? How can we make it go farther and better? And that all comes down to reliability. So how are we going to improve the airplane, all right? So one of the first things that takes place is some non-stop success areas. So the first non-stop across the U.S. is in 1923, May 2nd and 3rd. Lieutenant Oakley and Lieutenant John McGrady. We mentioned John McGrady earlier. He's the one who got up to 35,000 feet, right? The flight planning for this took place at McCook. And then once they set it up, they went to New York and they flew across the country, right? First around the world, the flight, 23 to 24. There were 4 teams put together. This is a picture of the aircraft that they had. They each had one. One had an accident in Alaska, taking off from Alaska, went into the water. They were able to repair that, and it worked at continuing the flight, but it didn't ultimately complete it. 6 months to go, 26,000 miles. Now the staging of this was all done through McCook. Now if we think about 1923, right, 24, right, there's these guys called the Soviet Union, and they're not very friendly with us. So in reality, we have to figure out where we're going to go. So we go across to Japan, then we go down what you might call the Eastern Pacific, the Philippines and the like, along their eastern shores there, and then across. But a comprehensive flight. Interestingly enough, and I don't put it up on my slides per se, but there were other teams competing with this, and we are the only ones that completed, and we had 2 of our 4 planes actually complete the circumnavigation. The planning for that, think about, you have to plan to go from Dayton, Ohio to Los Angeles, California, right? How did that take place? Well, this is what we're doing back in that period of time, and we're going around the world to do it. Okay? Radios. How are you going to communicate? So we had to figure out a way to start talking to one another, communicating with the ground. And so the radio section of McCook Field actually started to develop through the radio laboratory, the radio beacon and a communication device put in there. Now the tower, all right, we started to figure out we needed a tower to be able to communicate that. So this is a radio tower that we started to construct. And you're going to see here momentarily as we get into this, we not only have to construct this, we have to construct the lighting for this, to be able to carry this go forward here. How are we going to get from point A to point B and communicate with the ground, where we're going to, where we are at, and where we've been from? 3 lights were put into the cockpit. White, you're on path, okay? Red, you're one way, green, you're the other way. So get back in line. Tested in 1921 between Wright Field and Columbus, Ohio. And this is where we're going to build out the test airway system that gets into play here in just a little bit, okay? Also enhances standard radio, telephone, and telegraph transmitting unit. So the electronics world, we're leading a development using outside organizations to help coordinate with us to build better communications to move forward here. Instrumentation. Basic airplanes didn't have a whole lot of instrumentation, and now we're having to look at a number of different areas for improvement in the instrumentation. So we've collaborated with organizations. We build the induction compass, work with GE to do the development of that, all right, and come up with something called the Type B compass in 1918. Right? Also was working with Earth induction compasses. Drift Sight put images of the ground on a screen built by Bosch and Lone. So they actually were putting a screen with a layout on it, cross beams on it, so that you could look down, straight down from the aircraft, and you could see, am I going straight, or is my wind moving me left or right, and am I in a drift particular situation? Now this really works well if you can see where you're going, but if you can't see where you're going, that gets to be an interesting challenge there. The bank and turn indicator was built, and it leverages the gyroscope. But if you go into clouds, rain, visibility issues, right, this became a problem. And a guy by the name of William Oker, who he was a mechanic, he was one of the first, he was actually the third enlisted individual to be able to get his pilot's license and watch the Wright brothers fly. As this development unfolded, he was quite the mechanical genius, and he worked to modify. The first thing he did was modify the drift indicator such that it could keep your eyes focused on the gauge and tell you whether you're flying straight, flat, or you're getting lost and you're spinning around, because our brain will lose that, right? The tachometer was built by 1925. That brought some accuracy there. And the altimeter went through some interesting evolutions, but we came up with, by 1923, with 1 revolution for every 1,000 feet. So these are the instruments that are starting to go into the aircraft, that now I have a better opportunity to control the aircraft. Right? Bird of paradise flight. So we think about the long distance planning here, all right? There was a flight that was created out of McCook Field. We felt we needed to figure out how to go across water. And the greatest thing to do was fly from Oakland to Hawaii, all right? And so we did that in 28th and 29th of June, 2,425 miles. Now what's real interesting when you read the details into this is that they rigged up boats out there along the path that they would be able to communicate with, Some of them, they weren't able to make the communications, which had some limitations, but the radio equipment that we had been building, all right, was now installed into the airplane. They had a celestial strip map of 19 inches wide and 83 inches long. And there's two gentlemen who were flying the airplane, and as they swapped their position, they were continuing to look at this. Well, what were they looking at? At night, they were looking at the stars, all right, and making sure that they could see where they were going. Then they ran into some clouds, and they had to hope for the best to keep on flying in a straight line, but then came out of the clouds. They completed the trip in about 25 hours and landed safely at Maui, Hawaii, the first time that they've done that. Now, you notice the dates down here. Lindbergh's flight is May 20th to 21st, all right, and this flight is June 28th. So about a month later they're doing this. And there's a lot of feelings in some of the research worlds that Lindbergh got some great credit, as he well deserves, but there was a lot of land contact that he had. As he left New York, he's going up the East Coast. He goes over, he crosses Greenland, and then comes in to Ireland, crosses England, and then goes into France. This entire flight, once you've left the west coast of the US, was over water. You didn't see a thing until you got there. So it's a tremendous success to prove out the instrumentation, the planning for the flight, the reliability of the aircraft, all those things that were driven. And this was an event that was driven by McCook Field. Lighting. All right, we're going to bring in Lieutenant Don Brunner. And he becomes in charge of doing a point A to point B testing with this various equipment. Some of the lighting that goes on here from the airplane, a development of standard air service landing light system. So putting lights on airplanes so you can bring them down in the dark and be able to see where you're going to go on the runway. Development of emergency landing lights, lights to avoid collision. So our little blinking lights that are out on the side, the reds and the greens on the side. Creation of navigation lights and creation of lighting on the interior of the cockpit so I can see what I'm flying at there. All right? From the airfield standard, boundary lights are there. Colored lights, red and green, illuminated parts of the field. Put a floodlight on the windsock, ground beacon, revolving lights to see how I'm going to hone myself on into the particular situation. And then small beacon lights along the field, or along the path, right? So they set up a test system flight that they're going to be going from Wright Field over to Columbus and back. Okay. July 2nd to 13th, 1923, they run the first series of tests. They're making tweaks to the whole system that they've got there. Everything that I've shared with you so far is now being brought together. Reopened in April 7th of 24. 4 pilots were involved. You've had Rumer, then you had Harold Harris, our Caterpillar #1. We had a gentleman by the name of C.R. Crumming and Jimmy Doolittle. All right, so when we think about some of the famous things he did, this was another thing that Jimmy Doolittle got involved with in flying back and forth between here. They actually flew out of what is Patterson Field over there because of the size of the field of McCook. But McCook was the one driving the development for this. Right? The improvements on the beacons to be mounted every 15 to 20 miles. They started at 25 miles. All right? And they started with a 300-foot tower. And then as they made improvements, they shortened this up to 15 to 20 miles so that unless it was really ground zero fog, you could still see some reflections and be able to fly it. So they flew these test flights back and forth, and once they got the equipment reliable, yes, it was really a very significant development. So the equipment was put together. Here's, this is a display out at the museum. You have, this is a flashing beacon light, and then I went over to Norwalk, Ohio, where this is one of the few remaining towers that's now fenced in. It's you can't go inside and visit it, but it's an example of what was established eventually across the country. So you've got your tower there, you've got your lighting, and this is what we were proving out was going to be a successful way to go. Now remember, one of the things we improved was communications. So communications to the ground was also part of this and also essential to this, right? So what does this lead to? What this leads to is in 1918, right, the Army Air Service becomes the driver to assist the United States Postal Service on how to deliver airmail. The Postal Service created the desire and drove this project, but the person who was put in charge of this, of putting the aircraft and the route path and the pilots together, was McCook Field. And they take their start off and they realize that, well, the guy who was in charge of it was not very happy with the interactions with the Postal Service, so he decided, well, I'm going to discharge myself from this and I'm going to let somebody else do this. So he gets on out and leaves the organization. But they continue the development of airmail service, but it's a daytime service and it's if the weather is allowable. Well, there is a stretch to the truth when you get into the research. They flew in some pretty chunky weather, but they did fly during the day, not at night. With the adoption of the airway system in 1924, the Postal Service previews this system and puts it into play. And on 1924, they start the development of building a cross-country system. And the first system goes from New York City to San Francisco. There's 289 towers that are spread across the United States. And we start the first round of overnight airmail systems. And it's all at the roots of McCook Field. Okay. When we stop and think about some of the organizations that we think of today or know a little bit of the history about today, the people who start into this, the airmail service, right away, the Postal Service contracts on out to different organizations in order to fly the airmail system, right? The first 5 carriers is Robertson Aircraft Company. They hire Charles Lindbergh, right, as their chief pilot. Walter T. Varney, his company merges with United Airlines. He has one of the contract services that puts it into play. Western Air Service becomes one of the founding units of TWA. They're one of the first units. National Air Transport becomes part of United Aircraft, and then Colonial Air Transport and Juan Trippi, the two companies merge, and that becomes Pan Am Airways. So if we think about how did we get into airmail, we look at the very interesting things that these people, founding fathers, are really building upon in order to make this thing work. Other significant contributions came out of McCook Field. Right? Wind tunnel test, there's the 5-foot wind tunnel that lasted into the 40s. Right? The Etopsy D4 bomb site. This is the bomb site that was used in the demonstration flights by General Mitchell to sink the various German ships that we had captured and to prove that you can bomb ships and sink them there. This was developed at, it was developed in McCook Field, but it was developed with some outside organizations as well. Okay. There is the first cruise missile, or we call it the cruise missiles, the Kettering Bug. The interesting aspect, maybe some of you are aware of this, but Kettering was working on this in 1918 and was having a small degree of success at that point in time. When the war ended, and we never used this in the war, all right, he continued to work on it, and he didn't file a patent on it. He wanted to really get this thing to function. And he finally became very successful in the 20s with this. And when he finally got it to the way he wanted it, he filed a patent. Okay? In the very early 30s, a country by the name of Germany, right, and we know what's happening there, right, came over to our patent books and went through them and found this amongst other things that they found. And with that, they took it home, re-engineered it into the V1 buzz bomb. The V1 buzz bomb is a direct result of the Kettering bug. So, interesting story. Okay. Establishment of the publication section, and I mentioned that earlier. Our central sourcing for all kinds of publications, which then became a reference center for other aeronautical organizations that came to us to research it. Air Surface Engineering School, started by Edwin Aldrin. That is Buzz Aldrin's father on the lower left, okay? He started the school, attended the school, ran the school, all right? So in 1918, what we now know as AFIT was an engineering school at McCook Field, and that's where we were getting our advanced degrees. One of the graduates was Jimmy Doolittle. Crop dusting. Did you realize that McCook Field created the first crop duster, right? Farmers in the area, because let's go back into late 19-teens and early 1920s, and got a lot of, we already have a lot of farm around here now, but have a lot of farmland around here, and you know, we all have our various kind of bugs and all that. What could we do? So modifications to aircraft were designed and then tested to start with the crop duster type system, and there's an interesting example of a plane out of McCook Field for doing that, and the farmers loved it. All right? There becomes a time then when we have to move, and when you think about how things happened back then and how much money was raised out of all this, it's really fascinating. Most interesting individual who was in charge of the aviation section here was Colonel Bain. And as early as 1919, he's concerned about the size of McCook, lack thereof, all right, and the limitations that the runway poses to the advancement of the aircraft, and what are we going to be able to do about it. So as you move into 19 and 20 and 21, you start to see people are interested in this. What are we going to do about this? Okay. In May of 22, the Air Service is truly looking around, and they're looking at all the places from Washington, D.C. to Chicago, Illinois, and Indianapolis, and a lot of places in between. And the Dayton community gets wind of this, right? They were not aware of the inside organization, what they were really looking to be able to do. So a committee is formed, right? John Patterson, who is the founder of NCR, creates or influences the desire to have this and creates the committee to be able to say, we need to figure out how to, we can save this and what are we going to be able to do. And following the creation of the committee, he's on a train ride to Washington, D.C., and he passes away. But his son takes over for the initiative and keeps it going. He was being trained to, he's already been trained to be the CEO of NCR Corporation, so leading the committee was really not that much of a problem. October 31st and November 1st, 1922. They go out and canvass. They started at noon on October 31st, and they finished off at 5 o'clock on November 1st. Two-day fundraising raised $425,673. Okay, roughly in today's money, it's 7.5. And I think if you tried to buy that line for the land that they bought for 7.5 today, it wouldn't go very far. There might be a couple acres, but back then there's a lot of open land. Remember that there is a field called Patterson, not Patterson,
Wilbur Wright.
Thank you very much. Wilbur Wright Field, all right, that is, the land that we are on is leased. And now we look at where are we going to buy the rest of the land. But we have the money to be able to do it. And we said that if we have the rights to keep, we will buy the land, we'll consolidate the land, and we will give the land to the U.S. government for $1. And so we go to the head of the War Department, all right, and offer our deal to them, and they take it. So now what we have is we go out and buy an additional amount of land, and what ultimately happens here is a whole series of sequences that I won't go through, but other than we buy the land that is what is Wright Field today. We buy some land between Wright Field and Patterson Field, and we buy the land for Patterson Field, and we call it Wright Field. At a later point in time, they split that up and they create Patterson Field and Wright Field, and then after World War II, we actually bring them back together again, but we know them now as Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But a rather significant effort. Corporations donated to this, individuals committed to this, but to think about in 2 days, you raised $425,000 to save a significant organization to your community. It's kind of impressive. There it is. That's the only thing we got left, folks. All right. By the way, this is the replacement monument. I have a picture in my file of the first one that they put on up, which was nice, and I appreciate the fact that they did it. But this, they finally recognized, well, this is pretty important, and so this is the replacement monument that goes into place, or that you can see on the bike trail that goes along the east side of the Miami River. Okay. Now, we're starting to work on, in 2024, 2025, we're starting to work on building this thing called Wright Field, which we know as today as Wright Field. But in 1926, there's an organizational shift. And as I mentioned, I've got an interesting paper that I read all the way through, and the amount of organizational changes and appointments of this and that, et cetera, is monumental. But by this point in time, and we're looking at the future direction of where we're going, the Army Air Corps organizes into 3 major units. You have the Operations Division. That's headquartered in Washington, D.C. You have the Materials Division. Gee, does that sound familiar? You've got Brigadier General Gilmore, McCook Field, and later Wright Field, all are brought into one. Combines the Engineering and Supply Division, okay, and focuses on coordinating development, procurement, and maintenance of military aircraft, engines, and equipment. I might say today that's AFMC, right? And underneath that's AFRL. And then you had the training center, okay, was at Kelly Field, and with personal experience on my part, it became Lackland Air Force Base, where all the training is still done to this particular day. So when we look at kind of the evolution and some of the interesting things that have been developed here along the way, it becomes even more impressive, along with everything else that's happened here in the Dayton area, to see how, one, we've got to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, 2, what drove it, and to look at the innovation that took place. And I've just touched on the surface with some of these things. Like I said, I could probably have 4 or 5 more talks here with different verticals that I've even shared with you today about what they were able to accomplish with not a whole lot of money allocated by the U.S. government. So with that, I like to close by saying the rest is history. And anybody who's got some familiarity with what we've got going on here in the greater community today, and knowing some degree of history of Wright-Patterson, has a general idea of how significant this is to us. Today, by the way, we're pushing between 33,000 and 34,000 employees, headed towards about 35,000 when they finally get this thing all built out. So with that, I'll just conclude. I'll say this much here. Here's a couple of quick references. Like I said, I started with the book McCook Field from 17 to 27, but this did nothing but drive me into a whole lot more research to see where it's at. So with that, I'm open to questions if anybody has got questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I assume that because of the evolution of photography at McCook, that evolved into Foreign Technology Division and now NASIC, since it was already here, it evolved here. Is that probably true?
So NASIC came back here, but yes, that's true.
And FTD was before that.
Yes, right. And that's where it came from.
Then can you say the same thing on the evolution of radio and electronics at McCook evolved into Defense Electronic Supply Center being here?
The answer to that is yes, but recognize this, particularly in the time of the McCook Field days, before Wright Field days, we had a lot of equipment here, but we were working with all sorts of outside organizations as well to fine tune that. the biggest shift that takes place during the McCook Field timeframe, 17 to 27, particularly 19 to 27, is the movement from we're the headquarters for design and all that, and we'll even build some stuff, to then working with the manufacturers. The manufacturers almost revolted against the Army Air Corps because they were not getting cooperation out of them and saying, well, what are we supposed to do? What are we going to build? And we were doing some building, but we were not getting enough out to them. So that goes to the radio equipment, goes to all the different pieces of that org chart that I showed you. So now we become the center of research and controlling the manufacturing process, but we're going to do it to the outside organization, or through the outside organizations.
So Jesse was here because of that need to
Yep.
coordinate it all.
Yep.
Well, I could comment something because having worked for DOE, for NASA, and for DOD organizations over the years, that's the infrastructure that the military has to go through. That evolved here, right?
Correct? Yes, absolutely. So if you go back, this is a significant picture because this is at a 10,000 foot level, this is how the Air Force is organized today. Now, do we have commands? Yes. Do we have them then? No, right? But the structuring of operations and materials and research and training were the three fundamental pieces that they put together and drove out of McCook. And now we look at all the air bases we've got and all the different things that we're doing. So yes, right? There's a question back. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've played softball down there since the late 60s.
Yes, sir.
On the softball times. Second question, or another question, Larry Connor's new school there on Deeds Point, is that part of the original?
At Deeds Point, no. So,
That's right there at the,
You're right.
the rivers.
come on, baby. There you go.
Okay, I was just wondering.
No, let me. I hit the wrong key. You look at if you look here, here's Deeds Point right here.
Right.
Okay, so there was a community right here, and we used to have a road that goes over, and that bridge isn't there anymore. Okay, here is McCook Field, and this is kind of the edge of the field.
Okay.
I often talk about it being Miami, Mad, and Kiwi Street, right? And it goes out. Kiwi does a short bend right there, and that's just about at the end of McCook Field and where it was at. Their grounds went out over to about here. This was their land, but reality was it was the airfield, and all of the hangars and research facilities were right in here. Other questions? Yes, sir.
From the beginning, you mentioned that there was a publication, a library aspect of the organizations. Do you have any evidence of what their strategy, what their expectations for publication and access were? This is funded by your tax dollars. It's open to anybody. No, this is important. It's restricted. Do you have any information about how they looked at their publications?
I'll be able to speak to it from this standpoint. They saw the opportunity coming out of World War I, so 1919, to be housing whatever publications they could get and to publish publications out of the organizations.
Right.
But they were limited in their publishing of them to manufacturers, and not just aircraft manufacturers, but because some of these things were with communications and with radios and with wheels and with engines and with munitions, all right? But they wanted to become the central location in the United States at that time, and then to be able to provide that. The average individual could not come into that organization. And that's where the engine museums got its start also in 1918, and you couldn't come in with, you had to be somebody of significance to an
Official
organization.
business only, right? It had to be official
Yeah.
business only. It
Yes.
wasn't- It wasn't for sightseeing or.
Right.
Or curiosity.
Mhm.
Yep.
But,
Thank you.
I had one question. It was curious that the community raised the 470,
425.
425 to actually, what was their motivation to then give it to the federal government? To keep employment here? To keep, what was the reason? 'Cause-
Keep making statements, they're all gonna be right. Yes, we saw a potential huge loss of employment in the community if it moved anywhere. And one of the thoughts was to move to Fort Myer. But that was just one of the locations that I thought. But the community there'd been a significant growth to the base, and there had been significant growth to the community. And they looked at, if they were going to move it, they were gonna lose it all. And so not only were jobs themselves going away, but a lot of intellect was going to go away as well. And I worked for NCR for a number of years, and so I got familiar with John Patterson and the developments that he brought to the community, and et cetera. And so he was obviously a leader within trying to spearhead this. When we found out we had the potential to lose it, what are we going to do about it? And that spirit let off like
It
crazy.
was to keep the empire here.
Right here.
And
And there's the other piece, in case I didn't make that clear enough. We paid for the land to the owners of the land and consolidated it, right? And then created the deed to it and gave that deed with the request with pay us $1. So if you think about what Wright Patterson is today, all right, it cost the government $1 to get that. It cost our community about $425,000 to buy that land and consolidate it. But yes, it was with the commitment of leaving it here. The Army was to leave it here in Dayton, Ohio,
all right. Well,
and Greene County.
all right, Don, thank you very much.
All right, pleasure. Thank you very much.